Congressman Lamborn from Colorado, the district that I went to college in that little school in the Rocky Mountains that many of you know about. He represents Colorado's 5th district and has been serving in Congress since 2007. He currently serves on the House Armed Services Committee, and I got to tell you, I've had the, I guess I'll call it the opportunity to go ahead and defend the president's budget during the last administration in front of that committee a lot of times. And Congressman Lamborn was never a very easy customer to satisfy, but he always asked the hard questions, especially on weather things that I remember answering quite well. So I appreciate that, because that's the kind of questions that we need to answer. I want to thank you for being here this morning, Congressman, and I'm going to turn the mic over to you and have your remarks. Thank you. Thank you.
Well, good morning, and thank you, Doug, and it's great to be back here for the second one of these conferences. I'm so encouraged that Secretary Wilson was here this morning and that she has spent so much of her time on the job getting back up to speed on space issues, including, of course, finding out what's going on back in Colorado Springs. I'm delighted to be here with my good friends and colleagues. You just heard from Jim Bridenstine, who co-chairs the Space Power Caucus with me, and Brian Babin, who does great work as chair of the Space Subcommittee on SST. And I'd also be remiss if I didn't thank Fiscal Track and the Mitchell Institute for their hard work in organizing this event, and all of the industry partners who are here today. Thank you for all that you do. Well, we've spent this week on the House Armed Services Committee digging into the DoD top line, or overall spending amount, especially regarding what's needed to rebuild readiness. We heard testimony from Secretary Mattis and Chairman Dunford Monday night, who confirmed that funding the requirements on the unfunded priority list, and we've also already had questions about that, would make our military stronger and our country safer. I'm hopeful that we will get to a $640 billion top line in the NDAA this year instead of the $603 that's been proposed, and be able to do the hard bipartisan and bicameral work needed to appropriate a similar number. As easy as it is to get caught up in the numbers of this time of year, we also need to see beyond that. As Chairman Thornberry said this week, the real issue, quote, is what these numbers provide for the men and women who serve and what security the budget provides to the nation, unquote. Now, as far as space funding, I think there are some positive trends in the fiscal year 18 request, which I will briefly highlight. Tying in the DoD top line conversation, I also want to touch on the almost $800 million of space requirements on the Air Force unfunded priorities list, which we've also had questions about. I'd then like to spend the remainder of my remarks trying to frame this within the overall context of evaluating whether we are really on the way to making space great again. I couldn't resist that. The fiscal year 18 budget request contains about $9.8 billion for unclassified military space systems, and I'm pleased that there's an over 20% growth from the fiscal year 17 space spending amount. And I'm especially encouraged to see some important investments in R&D, an increase of over $730 million compared to what was projected. With space R&D spending having been at a 30-year low last year, the only way to go is up. And I certainly agree with many of the choices: invigorating operationally responsive space, space training, space situational awareness, and unclassified counter space and space control. Finally, putting real money into the National Space Defense Center, or NSDC, is overdue. According to the Air Force, and you heard from Heather this morning, the money will transition the NSDC from an experimentation effort to an operational capability, enhancing joint awareness, tactics, and doctrine for space. And I think that's a wonderful step forward. Space is finally a major force program, MFP 12, as Heather said, in this year's budget, which is helpful in enhancing the traceability and visibility of overall investment in space. However, we need to make sure that the MFP actually captures the entire space budget in a clear, publicly available way. More transparency and visibility into the space budget will enable better congressional oversight and will better enable understanding and advocacy from the Hill, as well as other stakeholders, many of which are in the room here today. Now, stepping back and looking at the bigger budget picture, you have to ask, is this good enough? Compared to the overall DoD base budget, MFP 12 funding has only gone from 1.1% to 1.2% of the whole budget. Now that's $350 billion, but we're only talking 1.1 to 1.2. 0.1% growth is nothing to write home about, especially when you consider that we once spent easily 10 times that much on space as the share of the overall defense budget. It's a slightly better picture when you look at all space spending, but not much. The $9.8 billion for space went from 1.4% of the overall defense budget last year to 1.8% this year. Simply put, underinvestment in space is a huge problem. Unfortunately, I don't think we're anywhere near close to a place where we can stand up and cheer, much less declare mission accomplished. In fact, when you look at the gap between where we are and where we should be, you quickly get into the more important questions of what we are spending money on and why. The main questions we keep asking here on the Hill are, when it comes to defending ourselves in space, who is responsible? And do we have the right level of leadership, prioritization, resources, and people focused on this problem? Now, you heard the Secretary say that the Air Force is starting to really concentrate even more on this, but I still have serious questions and concerns. Despite the talk about new threats and a paradigm shift to warfighting, are we putting our money where our mouth is? And most importantly, how is anyone ever going to take responsibility for space if no one's in charge? I will cite just one specific recent example from a budgeting standpoint. I am completely baffled that there are $138 million of unfunded BMC-2 requirements on the Air Force's list, as well as $100 million of unfunded SSA requirements. From the former DepSecDef to the current STRATCOM commander and former and current Air Force leadership, how many senior officials and officers at DoD have to say this is a priority for it actually to be a priority? Testifying at SASC just last month, General Goldfein said this, quote, ensuring that we truly understand and can characterize the threat, and then perhaps just as importantly as the constellations themselves, the command and control architecture that we are building in to first characterize and then be able to get the decision speed we need to respond quickly, are all part of the space operating construct that we are working toward, unquote. General Raymond had similar words. Quote, I would characterize space as a warfighting domain, just like air, land, and sea. And in any of these warfighting domains, you have to have the ability to command and control forces in that domain. You have to have the ability to have space situational awareness or situational awareness in that domain, unquote. If you asked anyone in the department if SSA and BMC-2 are top priorities, they would respond similarly. Yet we have at least $240 million of unfunded requirements here. I'm also still not convinced that the dollars we are spending are well spent when it comes to fully embracing commercial and other non-traditional acquisitional approaches. This one example speaks volumes of needing leadership, not just in terms of words, but in terms of actual dollars and levels of prioritization and leadership. Now, when we talk about space, we seem to always talk about the Air Force, which is for obvious reasons. But we also need to remember that the Air Force is not the only service in the space enterprise. For example, the Army has 4,000 soldiers in their space cadre and are very good at training, developing, and keeping a strong link between acquisition and operations. But back to the issue of whether the Air Force can properly prioritize space, let's face it, they have so many other things to buy, including new fighters, new tankers, new bombers, and of course new nuclear weapons, all of which are things we absolutely have to buy, and all of which are expensive. But the Air Force doesn't have enough space personnel, and the space personnel they do have, unfortunately, have the lowest promotion rates in the Air Force. Not enough people who don't get promoted enough and who are also way underrepresented in Air Force leadership. Of the 50 generals currently on the air staff, guess how many space officers there are? One. And if you count the A11, that'll be two. Meanwhile, the rest of DoD really just wants the Air Force to provide space services as cheaply as possible. Is that the space strategy that we want? To get as much as we can for as cheap as we can and operate our satellites wherever and however it's the most convenient? Especially when China can just decide overnight to form a new operational space, EW, and cyber force, and it just happens. They snap their fingers and it happens. And that's exactly what they did a year and a half ago. But let's step back and look at this briefly from an historical perspective. Those in here who know their space history realize that these issues are not new. Just like King Solomon said, there's nothing new under the sun. In the late 1970s, we had the Space Missions Organizational Planning Study, which along with the Air Force's 1980 Summer Study on Space, highlighted organizational deficiencies that prevented the Air Force from fully realizing opportunities in space, eventually leading to the creation of a new major command for space operations. In 1981, the Air Staff created the Directorate for Space Operations, which conducted an intensive survey on how to better organize to use space as a support tool in warfighting. As we all know, Air Force Space Command was born shortly afterwards in 1982, bringing together the Aerospace Defense Center, Strategic Air Command, Air Force Systems Command, and the Air Force Communications Command. Meanwhile, Congress was pretty critical of space organization and management in the early 1980s. In fact, Congressman Ken Kramer, who at that time represented Colorado Springs, introduced H.R. 5130, the Aerospace Force Act. That was in 1982. Co-sponsors included Newt Gingrich, Ike Skeleton, and Duncan Hunter Sr. Had it passed, this bill would have renamed the Air Force the Aerospace Force and required the Aerospace Force to be trained and equipped for prompt and sustained offensive and defensive operations in air and space, including coordination with ground and naval forces and the preservation of free access to space for U.S. spacecraft. Finally, the bill would have directed the Secretary of the Aerospace Force to report to Congress on the feasibility of establishing a separate space command. The late 1990s saw renewed criticism from the Hill. Senator Bob Smith from New Hampshire, at that time chairman of the SASC Strategic Forces Subcommittee, questioned whether the Air Force was committed to space power and threatened to seek creation of a separate space force. In a speech Senator Smith gave in 1998, he argued that the Air Force was, quote, basically dedicated to supporting non-space forms of power projection. This is not space warfare. It is using space to support air, sea, and land warfare, unquote. His concluding paragraph was fairly aggressive, and I think I should quote these several sentences in their entirety. If the Air Force cannot or will not embrace space power, we in Congress will have to drag them there, kicking and screaming if necessary, or perhaps establish an entirely new service. Drastic as that sounds, it is an increasingly real option that may be necessary to put this nation on a course towards space power. Frankly, I am less concerned with who delivers space power than I am committed to getting it done. This view is increasingly shared by my colleagues, and frankly, all this foot dragging is making the concept of a space force more likely, unquote. Now, out of this concern, the fiscal year 2000 NDAA authorized the Rumsfeld Commission. In early 2001, the commission finished its work, recommending significant organizational realignment and increased space responsibilities for the Air Force. In May of 2001, Secretary Rumsfeld announced a major national security space management and organizational initiative designated the Air Force as the executive agent for space and realigned SMC under Air Force Space Command. One key excerpt from the 2001 Rumsfeld Commission sounds familiar to where we are today. Space capabilities are not funded at a level commensurate with their relative importance, nor is there a plan in place to build up to the investments needed to modernize existing systems and procure new capabilities. Does that sound familiar? The Commission recommended robust additional resources to accomplish new missions such as improved SSA, missile warning, and enhanced space protection, and also recommended, quote, organizational changes to bring a more focused, well-directed approach to the conduct of national security space activities based on a clear national space policy directed by the President, unquote. Tragically, 9/11 happened shortly afterwards, resulting in most of these recommendations being shelved. Fast forwarding through the next 15 years, there were 3 additional major studies. The Defense Science Board in 2003, the Allard Commission in 2008, which famously found that no one is in charge of space, and the HPSI report in 2008. Together with the Rumsfeld Commission, these studies made 28 recommendations related to space as a national security priority, unified leadership and authority, improved coordination, budget planning, and acquisition. All of this was helpfully summarized by last year's GAO report, which was the main impetus behind the HASC Strategic Forces Subcommittee focus this past year on space reform. We've had about half a dozen public hearings and at least as many closed ones. I am very thankful for Chairman Mike Rogers' leadership, but I want to be clear, the rest of the subcommittee shares his concerns as well as the sense of urgency to do anything but business as usual. The good news is the American public is increasingly engaged in the space conversation. Space is suddenly hot again, and so it seems, and we are seeing space stories in major newspapers and on major networks, including pieces like CNN's War in Space special last November. I'll bet all of you saw that. The other good news is that across DoD, industry, and the Hill, we all agree on the challenge that we are simply not well organized to maintain our leadership and competitive advantage in space. Gaining consensus on the solution, however, is obviously a lot more complicated. I think part of the lack of consensus stems from various opinions regarding how urgent the problem is. From there come the various opinions about how much reform is needed. All I know is we can't afford to rearrange the deck chairs. We can't just do another study. There are so many urgent questions that demand fresh thinking. Who will think strategically about space warfare, develop doctrine for the space domain, build a space warrior culture, and ensure these space warriors have the best equipment money can buy? How will we develop our future space warriors and ensure they are truly focused on warfighting rather than just engineering? Who will think long and hard about training and preparing for a contest in a domain where none has occurred before? Who will take the risk to fully embrace new thinking, including non-traditional acquisitional approaches, and actually leveraging the private sector to the maximum extent possible, instead of just paying lip service to it? And who will solve the hard problems? For example, how to grow our rapid launch and rapid reconstitution capabilities, taking a hard look at small sats and even CubeSats. We absolutely must work together to figure this out. And that's why an event like the one here today is such a great opportunity. The dialogue is important, but obviously taking action is even more important. As you know better than anyone else, our potential enemies are not sitting still. Our future literally depends on it. Thank you.